About 2 weeks ago, Travis Gafford reported that LCS Team owners have been pressuring Riot to remove the import rule in competitive League of Legends. Riot has since stayed silent on the issue, and rumor is they are not shutting this down and at the very least are considering it. Travis has since pressed every owner about this issue, and all 10 of them have now given responses where they have either said they are straight up in favor of removing this rule or want to change it, or a few of them just kind of dodged the question in a super dumb PR kind of way. This would be terrible, though. This would be the single worst thing to happen to competitive League of Legends and would permanently damage the ecosystem. At the very least, it would kill off any semblance of native North American professional league. But I want to talk about this today because of how terrifying this prospect sounds. But we're going to try and talk about all of this. I want to talk about it start to finish, address every angle of this issue, why owners want this, why some fans seem on board with it, and why I disagree heavily with all of them. So let's go ahead and jump right in. To start this off, let me make one thing abundantly clear. If this rule were to be removed, native North American League of Legends would die. We would immediately see teams begin fading out native North American players that are currently on their rosters, and we would probably be 1 to 2 years removed of seeing 0 native NA players in the LCS. We know this for it's all but certain. We have so much evidence that we will get into in a moment that points to this being the scenario we're headed towards if that rule is removed. But maybe more importantly than that, there would never be a way for a native North American player to ever go pro in League of Legends again. And we would likely see any kind of amateur or academy scene die immediately. Now, team owners probably don't want this, or they would say that they don't want this, and they would disagree with me saying that, oh no, we can still support developing local talent and also get rid of the import rule. These are not mutually exclusive things, which I would take with a grain of salt. Remember, actions speak louder than words, always, and we are not that far removed from when owners were asking for franchising. If you guys remember, about 3 to 4 years ago, I think, is when owners started clamoring at Riot saying that they wanted to franchise all of the professional leagues in League of Legends. And one of the main reasons that they said they wanted to franchise leagues was they said that they were unable to give local talented players shots. In a promotion relegation system like we used to have, if a team was relegated, that was death for an organization. It was all but impossible for a team to be profitable if they got relegated, and there would be no way for them to still succeed as an organization in a way that kind of forced teams to do whatever they could to stay in a top league, which that might mean getting a bunch of imported players and not taking chances on NA rookies or local rookies in any league. Every league used to be promotion relegation, but owners clamored enough. They said they needed franchising to take risks on local talent, and look how that turned out. Every single league is franchised right now. Every single professional League of Legends region runs a franchised league, and in some of the regions like North America, we are seeing fewer and fewer resident North American players getting opportunities to play professional League of Legends. That was either a lie or owners weren't thinking that far ahead about what they would actually do. The fact of the matter is, the import rule that we have right now is the only thing. The import rule is the only thing that encourages LCS teams to care at all about developing local talent. And owners are asking to get rid of it. Keep that in mind. The import rule, it's the only thing that encourages teams to care about developing local talent, and owners are asking to get rid of it. That should tell you all that you need to know about this situation. We'll talk about why it's beneficial for owners to get rid of this rule, what it does for owners that's making them push so hard for this in a moment. But let me go ahead and just explain very quickly here. This would kill resident local North American talent. We already have little to no local NA talent with the current system that we have set up right now. If we define imports different from how leagues define them right now, and we just define imports as a player being an import if they were born and raised in another country and played professional League of Legends in another country before coming to North America, then we already have a lot of teams that don't have any resident players on them, or very few. Right now, actually, 4 teams are down to just 1 resident player and are running for imports by this new sort of definition we came up with. For instance, on Team Liquid, they have 4 imports. Only Tactical he's the last resident NA player. TSM only has Spica, who is the last resident North American player. They have Lost, who's a part of the Oceania thing, but they are running 4 imports. 100 Thieves only has Demonte. Evil Geniuses only has Deathly. We are already down to very few resident North American players. It's a league that's almost entirely made up of imports. That's four of the 6 teams in the league are already down to 1 resident NA player, and these owners are now asking to get rid of him. That's what they want to get, the number down to 0. They don't want to have any resident NA players left. They want to cut the last guy or the last couple of guys that they have on their rosters. And it's incredibly sad to hear. Let me explain very briefly what the system is we have right now and why I'm kind of okay with it, even though it is already hurting local talent so much. The import rule that currently exists is that a team can only have 2 imports on a starting roster, with an import being defined as a non-permanent resident. So this kind of changes based on the league because it's based on the immigration laws of the country that the league is hosted in. So for instance, in the United States, it takes 5 years of living and working here to get a green card, to get permanent residency status. And so it takes 5 years of a team or of a player playing in the LCS for a team or a couple of teams before they are considered a resident and no longer take up an import spot. Again, this is already kind of hurting local talent. We already have a few teams that are almost entirely made up of imports, but it's kind of okay. I'm actually kind of okay with the system that we have right now, and there's 2 main reasons for that. The first reason is you can't just totally judge people based on where they're born. This is something that I'm sure you guys are pretty well aware of. It's almost a stereotype now in the West or whatever, that America and Canada are nations of immigrants, that very few people that live in America and Canada are natives to the land. We're all either immigrants ourselves or descendants of immigrants from Europe and Asia and whatnot. And that's something that still exists in a pretty major way today. There are plenty of people that are born in Mexico and Canada in developing countries or in Europe or anywhere else. There are plenty of people that are born in other countries but move to America when they're very young, and they grow up here. They grow up speaking English. They go to American schools. They watch American movies, consume American culture, and they are, for all intents and purposes, just as American as anyone else. They're American citizens. That's kind of the whole cool thing about America and Canada, right? Whatever. Because there are so many people here who are either like first generation immigrants themselves or were just born somewhere else, you can't really tie a player's residency to where they were born, the country they were born in. Spica is a great example of that. The jungler on TSM, he was born in China, but he's again as American as any other American out there. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the second reason this rule is kind of okay right now, which is to gain residency status for a team right now, you basically have to become an American. You have to go through the immigration process the same way that any other immigrant does if you want to become a resident in in North America and get residency status, no longer be considered an import in the LCS. If you take a look at someone like Bjergsen was never considered an import because he started playing in NA before the import rule was made, so he was grandfathered in. But he is someone who has been here for so long, who has lived and worked in the United States for so long, he doesn't even have an accent anymore. And that's true for a lot of these guys. A lot of the people that gain residency status, they move to the United States, they move their families, their significant others, they live here, they eat the food, they go and consume the culture, yada, yada, yada. They integrate into society the way that everyone talks about when they talk about the American dream. So it's kind of okay that even though there are some teams out there that have 3 or even 4 imports, maybe we'll see a team with 5 imports soon, they aren't really all imports. Many of them have to go through the same sort of processes that any immigrant does, and they kind of deserve to be treated the same way that any other American citizen does. So why are owners trying to get rid of this system? There's a couple of reasons for it, but it essentially comes down to finances and how players are paid. Imports in League of Legends are very expensive. If you take a look at the imports that come to North America and play in the LCS, they are very expensive, and teams have to pay a lot of money to get them, in the current system at least. Teams can only have 2 imports, and because of that, they are kind of limited. They need to use those import slots on very good players who can single-handedly make their team great. Players like Sumde, players like Bjergsen, players like Alfari, the superstar players that you can build a franchise around. That's who you want to have as your import. And because of this, those imported players, they know. Those imported players understand that they are a hot commodity, so they can jack up their price and demand some very expensive salaries. This is also kind of true for the resident players, the players who are imports that stay so long they get residency status. They know that being a player that, some of them, they are genuinely superstar players, someone like Sumde, he is a fantastic player who I'm sure knows that he is a very valuable commodity because he plays like a top Korean star. Even though he has been in North America for so long, he's now considered an NA resident, and again, he can demand exuberant salaries and get paid tons of money that teams have to shell out for if they want to build their rosters this way. So think about it from this perspective. If owners are able to get rid of that import rule, that gives teams so much more flexibility with how they construct rosters. If a team, for instance, wants to go out and get challenger Korean players who are not the top challengers, but maybe like the 100th challenger player, the 90th challenger player, whatever, players who would not be in the LCK, maybe players that wouldn't even be in Academy. Those are players that still could destroy North America. And team owners would have way more leverage when operating with negotiation with those players, because those players, they aren't getting huge offers from the LPL. They aren't getting huge offers from the LCK, but they could get decent-sized offers from the LCS and get to go pro themselves. And so those players, team owners would love to have them. They would love to have an all-Korean challenger team that could easily stomp all the other talent in North America, an all-Chinese team from the Chinese solo queue ladder on the Chinese super server. They would love to be able to get just an all-5-man roster of Chinese players. And, this opportunity to get those kinds of rosters would also give them more leverage in negotiating with the current imports or negotiating with the superstar imports. If a team is trying to sign Alfari or Someday, they can say, we will pay you because you are good, but we can also go and construct a roster in a way that doesn't need you. And if you don't come down on your salary, then we're going to go and build a team a different way. This is really where this desire is coming from. It's for cheaper rosters and more roster construction flexibility for teams and team owners. Another way to say it more bluntly is it kind of just boils down to money for the team owners, but some fans are okay with this because they see it as a positive. Some people believe that if we bring more good players into North America, it would elevate the region. That would give more opportunity for the local talent to practice against superstar world-class players, and that could make local North American players better. This could also in turn improve solo queue. It could make solo queue better. The solo queue situation in North America right now is terrible. If you are a rank 1 player in Korea, you will have a tryout opportunity for every single LCK team. But if you're a rank 1 North American solo queue player in Challenger NA, you're a streamer, you're playing Among Us for YouTube content, you're not respected. That's something that's obviously a problem, and a lot of people acknowledge that, and they say like, hey, yeah, let's bring in more great foreign talent, and that can elevate the level of solo queue for everyone and make everyone better in North America if we just do that. And there's also probably a few people out there that believe that LCS, an LCS team could maybe win Worlds. Theoretically, you could have a situation where someone like Team Liquid or TSM, who's very wealthy, could go out and, let's say Dom1 Gaming wins Worlds. They could go and try and sign the entire Dom1 Gaming roster. If they have the money to make that happen, that could possibly happen, and then they would have a world-class team defending world champions and could go and try and win Worlds. Now, things actually don't sound all that bad if you take a look at them the way that I kind of laid it out right there, but we know, unfortunately, that is not what's going to happen if this import rule were ever to be removed. If the import rule were to be removed, we know that solo queue would not improve. We basically know this for a fact because it hasn't improved, even though the region has been filtering in imports for a really long time. Imports have been coming to North America for, I think, 6 years, more than 6 years now. And is solo queue any better? Is rank 1 any more respected than it used to be? Hey, it used to actually be way more respected to get challenger or get high rating in North America, but it has gotten worse and worse as the years have gone on, and imports have done nothing to change that. There's been no discernible increase in the quality of solo queue, and imported players themselves have actually gone on record saying that they specifically do not play solo queue because they believe solo queue in the region makes you worse as a player. So they are avoiding playing solo queue at all costs, just practicing through scrimming with teammates and their team in professional settings. So we are not seeing an elevated solo queue ecosystem. That is not something that will somehow become better if we allow a couple more imports in. We also know that teams will not improve. LCS teams won't win worlds, if that's what you're hoping is going to happen. I did lay out a scenario where teams could go out and try and buy the Damwon gaming roster and win worlds through doing that, through seeing who the best team in the world is and then buying a roster and then trying to keep their talent up at world class for a year and then go make another great run. And in theory, that would be something that teams would be allowed to do. But in reality, teams would not be able to bring in squads in that sort of way. The LCS is already not really able to bring in super big free agents. There are great players that come to NA, like Alfari, like Sword Art recently, this past split, like Someday, like Core JJ. There are really great world-class players who get imported into the LCS. But there are also world-talented players, Nuggery, Faker, The Shy, Rookie. There are players that are arguably even better that specifically don't come to North America. And it's not because they don't get offers. They get offers. But it obviously varies from person to person. They might stay in Korea or they might go to China, but other regions like the LPL will offer seemingly great salaries. They are closer to their native homes. They're closer to their families. Some players might want to play in the LCK because they believe that the most prestigious thing a player can do is win a Korean title. And, we will not suddenly see an influx of better teams. We basically already know solo queue and the local player base won't get better. But we also know that teams won't be able to suddenly build world champion rosters. We know the teams are not, they aren't going to be able to win worlds just by finishing off their team with a final import, we already know there is already opportunity for players or for teams to go out and try and sign like the ultimate best players in the world, whoever that might be at the time you're watching this video. And, most of the time they can't get that kind of that sway. And again, it's not something that's going to happen with the import rule being lifted. But what is it teams will do then? If they get their way and we remove the import rule, what is it that teams will do differently to construct rosters, to try and build teams? What kind of teams can we expect to see? Well, again, we kind of know. We have plenty of evidence and plenty of history to look back on. The first thing that we know that they will do, just to repeat myself, they will get rid of their remaining native North American players. The teams out there like Team Liquid or TSM, the teams that have come out very, very strongly in favor of saying they want to get rid of the import rule, they will just get rid of the last non-import they have on their roster. They're already down to one native North American player. They'll just cut him, replace him with someone else, and we basically know that will happen. That is why these teams are asking for it. They are not asking for this rule change because it will somehow help out Academy or Amateur or the development of local talent. They are asking for this rule change because they want a team of all imports, and we know they will get rid of the remaining North American players. We also know that some teams will go out and try and build all Chinese or all Korean rosters. Again, they can go and look at the Chinese solo queue ladder, the Korean solo queue ladder, and try and just get some, get a 5-man of Korean players. They won't have to worry about an English barrier or anything like that, a language barrier. They'll be able to just bring in 5 Korean players or 5 Chinese players who might not be that good. Generally speaking, it would be advantageous to LCS teams to get someone who is not good enough to compete in LCK, so it's easier for them to negotiate salary. And this is something that has, again, already happened. This is why we have the import rule today. Back in 2013, there was a team in the LPL who was a kind of mediocre team named LMQ. I think they played one split in the LPL where they got like 9th or 12th or something. They did bad. and they eventually left China. They came over to North America. They won their way through the challenger scene to get promotion into LCS. So for like a split, maybe it was 2 splits, we had an all-Chinese team with a Chinese owner, Chinese coaches, Chinese development staff, and all Chinese players playing in the LCS, in the NALCS. That team was actually good enough that they went to the World Championship. They got a 3rd place finish in the summer of 2014, I think it was, where they went to Worlds representing the NALCS, even though there was nothing North American about them. Nothing about the organization, the management, the players, the coaches. They were all Chinese players who just came over to NA because they knew that even though they were terrible in the LPL by comparison, they could win in NA. And so that's what they did. And it turned out to be a pretty big competitive success for them, getting 3rd place, and then that's when Riot implemented the import rules. I don't know how many teams would go this route, but it would be foolish for them to not at least try. And I feel like there's a very good possibility that we could be, it might take a while, it might be 5 or even 10 years down the line, but there's a very real possibility the LCS just turned into essentially the B League of Chinese and Korean teams, just all Chinese and Korean teams. Like the LCS would essentially be the Academy League for other regions, maybe even EU as well. It would be disappointing and sad to see that would be the case, but I feel like that there's a very, very high possibility that would happen. Teams would be foolish not to try and do that. So how do we know all of this? Well, we know this because we have evidence. We have evidence in League's history with how importing players has turned out so far. We have evidence of teams like LMQ occurring when there was no import rule, and we also have evidence from other games. If you look at other esports out there that don't have any sort of region restrictions or requirements, stuff like the Overwatch League, stuff like StarCraft Brood War and StarCraft 2, you can see the exact same thing that we're describing right here happened in those games. In StarCraft 2 in particular, it was pretty egregious. I think it was 2010 to 2013 or 2014, there was the World Championship Series of StarCraft, which they still run, the WCS today, but back then they tried to run it based on regional leagues. There were 3 regional leagues, 1 in North America, 1 in Europe, and 1 in Korea. In these regional leagues, there was no requirement that said you actually had to be from the region to compete in the regional leagues. So what happened was Korean players just briefly hopped over to North America or Europe to play in these regional leagues, and they ended up winning. If you look at the victors of these tournaments, you see that it's nothing but Koreans topping the charts. And because those regional leagues then fed into like the World Championship, we saw Koreans representing North America, Koreans representing Europe, and Koreans representing South Korea in all of these regional leagues at the World Championship. I think by the last regional WCS, which was like season 3, the 3rd one they did, there was 1 player who was not Korean competing at the World Championship, because all the other players who won in Europe and North America for their regional leagues, they were actually just Koreans who briefly popped over to win the tournament and squash any local competition who hoped they could represent their region. Eventually, StarCraft 2 just got rid of the idea of having regional leagues, and today they just run different competitive leagues like the Africa Star League, different star leagues and that kind of stuff, where it's mostly Koreans that show up, and at the World Championship Series every year, it's, again, pretty much dominated by Koreans, although there are a couple of European players who are able to shine at various different moments. I don't know if there's ever been a European who's been able to win a WCS, but anyway, that's something that I kind of want to get out of the way here. Just to reiterate, because this point is so important, we know with almost 100% certainty that this is what will happen. Some people are fine with that. Some people like watching the WCS. Some people like watching StarCraft 2 nowadays and don't really care about making sure every region has representation. They just want to see the best play that there is in the world. And that's fine if that's your argument. But make no mistake, that is what will happen if we remove the import rule. If NA does not have the import rule, NA players will not be in the LCS, NA will have no representation in the LCS, and it will be almost impossible for any new NA stars to ever get a chance to play in the LCS again. NA players are already undervalued by LCS teams, even though it would be totally beneficial for them to even just take a shot on one of them. But this is something that's it's important to acknowledge. That is what will happen. NA players will cease to have opportunities to be professional League of Legends players, and you might be fine with that, but all of the evidence points to that being the world that we would live in, and there is not really any evidence that points to any other scenario. So, that being said, if you are okay with that, if you don't really care about regions having representation and you don't see like a moral problem with something like the LCS not having regional representation, let me give you let me kind of give you a sort of, I guess, more philosophical or moral argument. Specifically, let me ask you, what do you think the point of a sports league is? Because in my eyes, the point of a regional sports league is to represent the talent of the region it's hosted in to some degree. So, for instance, in League of Legends, that's the world that we have in League of Legends. There are many different regional leagues all across the globe. There is the LJL in Japan, the Turkish league, the Brazilian league. I mean, every minor region out there pretty much has their own league, and these are all regions that aren't going to win worlds. There would have to be drastic changes for Japan to ever win a world championship. But people still watch the LJL. People still watch, and they want to see what Japanese players do in the top level of competition in that nation. Maybe they're weeaboos, or maybe they are people that live in Japan and just want to see the best players of their country play. But even though they know that they will almost certainly never win a world championship, there are still people that want to watch that kind of stuff. This is not a new idea. This is pretty much par for the course in traditional sports. If you take a look at European soccer leagues, there are plenty of different rules out there, depending on the league you're talking about. In the Bundesliga, you have to have 12 players who are German players on a, I think, 25-man roster. You have to have 12 German players on your team, though. 8 of those players have to be trained in Germany. They have to be trained in the Bundesliga, like by a German club. And 4 of the players on your roster have to be trained specifically by your club. In the English Premier League, there's different rules. I think there's like a homegrown status where you have to have 7 or 8 players who are homegrown, which means that they are either English or Welsh, or they spent a significant amount of time getting trained at an English or Welsh academy. I mean, these are pretty loose rules that still allow for a lot of foreign-born players to come in and play for various different English teams, but there's still like some semblance of saying that, yes, we will allow for other European players to come in and play for our team, but there has to be something distinctly German about the German teams in the top German league of German soccer. They should be playing with a distinctly German feel about them, and that is why these kinds of rules are put into place. And I mean, European soccer has some of the loosest rules when it comes to this kind of stuff. If you take a look at other sports, it gets way more strict. In the NPB, in Japanese baseball, you are only allowed to have 4 players on a 25-man roster that are foreign-born. And you're also limited to only having either 3 pitchers or 3 fielders. Similarly, in the Korean baseball organization, you're only allowed to have 3 total players on a roster who are foreign-born, and you can only have a maximum of 2 pitchers, which these are pretty strict. You know, that means almost everybody in Japanese baseball is Japanese, and almost everybody in Korean baseball is Korean. And again, that's because these leagues understand that they're regional leagues. They are not the highest level of play in the world. I mean, the KBO in particular, that's kind of the equivalent of like American college baseball. That's pretty far down the rung. People are throwing like 86-mile-an-hour fastballs. I could throw an 86-mile-an-hour fastball, but the people that watch these, they don't care. Korean fans want to see something distinctly Korean about the Korean League of Korean baseball. In fact, the only sports leagues in the world that don't have any sort of restriction about having imports versus residents versus all these different ideas. The only sports that don't care about this kind of stuff are leagues that don't consider themselves to be regional. Leagues that consider themselves to be the world's best. Stuff like the NFL, the NBA, MLB. These are mostly American sports leagues, and they are also mostly about sports that Americans only care about. A lot of people care about baseball, and a lot of European nations have pretty healthy basketball scenes. But generally speaking, these are leagues that they're already kind of dominated by Americans, and that's because they're sports that are pretty American-centric. But they also kind of don't care about this kind of quota because they view themselves as being more about being the highest level of competition. In baseball, at the end of every MLB season, there is the World Series. And it's not called the World Series because teams play against opponents from all over the world. Only two nations, the United States and Canada, compete in the World Series. And that's only if the Blue Jays make it in. But they still call it the World Series because it has all of the world's best players. The best Dominican players, the best Korean players, the best Japanese players are in the MLB. They are the entire world sends its greatest talent to Major League Baseball, which gives it this sense of watching extremely high level of play, where you are watching for the play just as much as you are watching to root for a specific team. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. The LCS doesn't have that. The LCS will never be that. The LCS will never be the premier place that people go to watch professional League of Legends. The LCK and LPL just care about League more. They care about computer games more. The citizens that live in Korea and China care way more about computer games than the people that live in Canada and North America, the United States. It's something that's just kind of a fact of life, and the LCS will never be the best, most quality league in the world. It will always be a regional league. And I just think if it's a regional league, it should have something to do with the region it's based in. I don't want to see a team or a league that's filled with LMQs. I don't want to see a league that has literally nothing to do with the region it's hosted in. And that is exactly where we will go if we see this import rule lifted. If the import rule gets lifted, I will personally never watch the LCS again. I already hardly watch it, but I will never watch the LCS ever again. There's no reason to. What reason would anyone ever have to watch a Korean B League or a Chinese B League or a European B League? All the best players in Europe are in the LEC. All the best players in China are in the LPL. And if you want to watch the best players in the world, you can watch the LPL or the LCK. There's no reason to go and watch an amateur league that's filled with people who aren't even from the region they're playing in. It's something that I can't understand why any team owner they aren't thinking far enough ahead, I feel like, and I'm very worried about this even being a possibility that it goes through. But that being said, hope you enjoyed watching this video. Subscribe for more content here on our third channel. But I will see you all next time. Until then, though, thank you very much for watching. Good luck in solo queue, and have a wonderful day.